Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Sam Shay. I'm a chiropractor, fit genes practitioner, member of the Institute for Functional Medicine. Today we're going to go over the genetic test called FoodChoice. Now you can get this test if you've done a cheek swab with fit genes or if you've already done a 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you can have that data transferred over to fit genes and they can generate this report for you, and you can find out your intolerances and sensitivities to gluten, lactose, alcohol, caffeine, and salt. Additionally, when I work with people with FoodChoice, I give them a 15-minute consult to go over these results and answer any questions. I'm going to go over my results, which would be very useful to give it as a demo of what this report and the significance of it actually means. And so the reason why FitGenes came up with these 5 particular food items for the FoodChoice profile is that these are the 5 most common food substances that people interact with on a daily basis, at least one of them a day, almost always. And so it's gluten, dairy, alcohol, caffeine, and salt. And it'd be very, 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 very useful to know where are you genetically in terms of risks of intolerances and sensitivity to gluten, to celiac, lactose intolerance, alcohol sensitivity, or even the risk of alcoholism, caffeine sensitivity, particularly anxiety-induced caffeine sensitivity, which is what I have, and salt sensitivity. Some people are sensitive to salt in terms of blood pressure, some people aren't. So it's very, very important to know your relationship with these 5 food substances because they're just everywhere. Now, as a background, what is a gene? A gene is a recipe out of a book from your genetic library. So the nucleus is the library in the cell, the chromosome is the book, and in the chromosome, in the book has chapters called DNA, and within each chapter there's recipes called genes. Now, different people have slight variations on their recipe, and as a result, their ability to adapt to certain food substances and other things is slightly different from person to person. So the reason why that works is that in order to create your book, there's 2 authors, mom and dad, and if there are 2, quote, good copies of the recipe, then you get a green dot, which is a traffic light system, green, yellow, red. If you get 1 bad copy from one parent, 1 from another, it doesn't matter which one gave you which, it's a yellow, and if you have 2 bad copies, then it's a red. And what that means is that there's a higher risk of a negative consequence the more bad copies, if you have a yellow or a red dot. Now, we're going to talk about celiac disease risk. Now, the spelling is different because FitGenes is out of Australia, so it's a British spelling, but it's referring to the same thing. There's 2 major genes associated with celiac disease, DQA and DQB, and this test checks for it. Now, I happen to have a green dot, meaning I don't have the risk genetically for celiac. Now, even if you did have a yellow or a red, it doesn't mean you automatically will get it. The way that it works is that your genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. So if you eat a lot of gluten and you've got an inflammation in your gut, and there's kind of these other things that kind of converge together, then you've got the genetic risk for it, then it's likely you develop celiac. Now, I always thought I was gluten intolerant, even though genetically it says here it's not, because whenever I would eat foods with gluten, I would get really bad digestion, and you'd think, oh, I'm probably gluten intolerant. Well, I'm not actually gluten intolerant because there's another genetic test called FoodChoice that showed that I was carb intolerant. So this is a different test. If you have 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you actually can't get this results. You have to do a fresh swab because this is a different genetic test. It's checking for a totally different thing than variations. It's checking for duplicates of this particular gene. But if you have a low number of duplicates of this gene, you have very, very low enzyme activity to break down carbs. So 1 to 4s, these people are like paleo and keto. 5 to 8s are more Mediterranean. 9+ is high carbs. And yes, there are high carb people genetically out there in the world. It's not that many, about 10%. Mediterranean is in this range. I'm a 2, so I have a very, very low carb tolerance. That's kind of an Eskimo range. So when you have low carb tolerance, that means if I eat carbs just even if it's organic, sprouted quinoa, whatever, but it just over that tipping point, I get really bad digestive problems and fatigue and all sorts of other stuff. And there's a much, much higher risk of losing glycemic control or blood sugar control. Like I get, I feel really weird when I have too many carbs. Even I thought I was doing all organic and sprouted and all these other stuff. It was still affecting me, and I realized it was because I had a very, very low tolerance to carbs. So this particular genetic test is really, really powerful, because if you know genetically if you're more suited for keto or paleo or Mediterranean or high carb, and you just count the number of meals per day and the number of meals per month and the number of meals per year and then your lifetime, this is a very, very, very powerful influence on your life, because it's determining the structure of your meals, how many carbs versus proteins and fats. So strongly recommend people get this carb choice test, because it totally changed my life, because I thought I was gluten intolerant, but really I'm carb intolerant. And once I reduced the amount of carbs to my genetic tolerance, my digestive problems went away. So going back here to FoodChoice, this is the first major one is celiac. And again, you even if you have gluten, if you feel you have gluten intolerance, even though you're a green dot, you may actually have carb intolerance. The next thing is lactose intolerance. So lactose intolerance has to do with an enzyme called lactase that breaks down the sugar lactose into the sugars galactose and glucose. Now, there are two main genes involved, LCT and MCM6. And now, surprise, I am actually a green dot. And I always had bad reactions to dairy. Now, I've run other food allergy panels to look at casein and whey, and it turns out lactose never came up on those panels, but I am actually intolerant to casein and whey, two of the other constituents that are in dairy. So this actually explains also why, like, it's not everything is about lactose with dairy. It can be casein and whey, like in my case. But if you are lactose intolerant, there are specific dairy foods that are low in lactose. Those, of course, you can get external enzymes to help you. And you may not be reactive to casein and whey, but there are other food intolerance tests to check for those. Then we have alcohol intolerance. Now, this one's really interesting. Some people, if they're a green dot, this is where being a green dot isn't necessarily a good thing. People who are red dots, they're at risk of what's called the alcohol flush reaction, because they can't process alcohol that well. And like, there's lots of factors that go into your tolerance to alcohol, like weight, age, your sex, the amount of fat on your body versus the amount of muscle, genetics, what you're drinking, is it mixed, did you eat before? Like, there's so many variables. Of course there are. And that's why that's called epigenetics. We're talking just about the genetic capacity here, because some people's, their playing field for their risk is way bigger, like they have more room to maneuver. Other people's is really, really tiny. And so their ability to adapt to whatever input, in this case alcohol, is really, really small. So what we're looking at here is, I'm a red dot, which means that I have really, really low tolerance to alcohol. And but the thing is that if you're a green dot, you're actually at a really higher risk of alcoholism, because you can tolerate alcohol much better, which means you can consume a lot more. By tolerate, you're not having like these flush reactions and things like that. So this is a case where a green dot is not actually a great thing. So it'd be very useful to know if you were a green dot or if your kids are a green dot, because then you'd have very different conversations with them about their relationship or your relationship with alcohol, because they're likely at a higher risk of alcoholism. So that's the alcohol. The next one is caffeine sensitivity. Now, there's caffeine in so many different things, but different things have different levels of caffeine. It also matters how much you drink the caffeine, and how much of it you drink, and so on and so forth. And there's two main genes we're looking at, CYP1A2 and ADORA2A, and this has to do with your ability to the caffeine's reactions to the caffeine's influence rather on your sleep and anxiety levels. Now, I get in retrospect, like, I should have seen this, because if I drink a lot of caffeine, like, I get anxious, and then I got this test result, I'm like, oh, of course I get anxious. Okay, I guess. So I can't really kid myself anymore around caffeine, no matter how much I buffer it with other things to help make it, less anxiety-inducing. It's just caffeine and I just don't get along, and that's really good for me to know. It also can explain how people can some like you see this in Europe a lot. Like people could just suck back espressos like it's nothing, even one before bed. And my suspicion that there's a lot of green dotness going on over there, because they have a very, very strong capacity to get rid of the caffeine and not have it linked to sleep and anxiety, not nearly as much as it is for someone like me. And lastly is salt. Now, salt is super critical. In like the salt roads, like major commerce, like wars were fought over salt. Gandhi helped inspire the separation from Britain over as part of doing the salt campaign. Salt's really, really important, and there's some people who have risk for triggering higher blood pressure in their, it's called their renin-angiotensin system, and that's really only important if you're a health nerd or you're a Scrabble enthusiast. This is how it's spelled. Really high score points there, renin-angiotensin. And it's really important to understand your relationship with salt, because there's a risk to spiking blood pressure. Now, there's many other factors that go into blood pressure. Of course there are, like it's weight, stress levels, adrenal health, all sorts of other things that go into it. But this is one of the influences, and it's an important influence. Like for me, I have to be very mindful of salt in regards to blood pressure. So the rest of the report, they go into, there's a lot of details. Here's kind of the nerdy science stuff, and then just insane amount of references. And then there's an entire supplementary file you get with the report that goes into the specifics about dairy, celiac, and all the rest of it in terms of what to do practically. And I'm more than happy to help walk you through that, to have a kind of a professional perspective on this, is like what do you do once you get your results in very practical, meaningful ways. So I hope this was helpful. Again, this is the FoodChoice test, and now related to the FoodChoice test, but it's not the same test at all, is Carb Choice, particularly if you want to know if you're a keto, a paleo Mediterranean, or a high carb. And that's really, really important in terms of weight management, blood sugar control, digestive health, as well as it has strong implications for exercise, because the lower you are, the better high intensity interval training is for you, and the higher you are, the more longer distance, slower like cardio is. And that makes total sense, because hunter-gatherers had to sprint after their food, whereas more agrarian, higher carb cultures walked around and grew their food. So the Carb Choice test is really, really significant, and it goes along really well with the FoodChoice test. So I hope you found this useful, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to schedule a chat with me below.